You know, of the three famous passages in the Bible, the Lord's Prayer and Psalm 23, and this passage, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, this is the one that has been referred to and spoken at by several people, and even I've preached quite a few times on this passage, but every time you come to it, it is very refreshing to get some new insights. And perhaps this is the first time we are working on this passage in the context of the whole book of 1 Corinthians. And many preachers are, including myself, are sometimes in danger when we just exegete this passage as an independent unit on love. We can sometimes miss out on some bigger, deeper, and larger truths that God is trying to speak to us. And this passage on love is sometimes used on Valentine's Day or on marriages. You have probably heard this passage read about. But this is actually not a passage about marriage. If you look at these 4 chapters, from chapter 11 to chapter 14, the central theme of this whole unit is on worship. And that's why we are titled this as Sacred Worship. And in each of the chapters, Paul is placing an emphasis on one or other aspect of worship. And today, in that context, Paul is coming to really the heart of worship. So it's in that context of worship, we want to look at this passage, and hopefully we will have some new insights and some new thoughts that come out of it that can be applied to ourselves. And I was looking back at some of my past sermons, and I was genuinely surprised how I missed some aspects of it, though they were good ones, and I liked it. So hopefully today I'll try to cover those gaps and really put this passage in this context and help us understand what real worship is. We worship what we love, isn't it? And love and worship go hand in hand together. And especially for those who have children, during Christmas, you might have had this experience where our kids give us a big list of gifts they want. And now, when they have their birthdays, the list starts coming a month before. What are all the things I need for my birthday? And if you look at what is it they want, they really love those things. It may be trivial to us, but for them it's big. And they can't wait till they open it because they feel that when they take it, it gives them a deep sense of joy. So when God is talking about worship, he goes straight to the heart of worship, which is our heart. And to understand a little bit of this passage, a little background might help to know something about the city of Corinth. You know, Corinth, as we have spoken a little earlier, could have been called in current times as a startup city. You know, it's a city that was 4 miles wide and 4 miles long, similar to San Francisco. San Francisco is 7 miles long and 7 miles wide. And Corinth is smack in the center of Greece, and it divides northern Greece and southern Greece. So if people had to go from north to south or south to north, they had to pass through the city of Corinth, sort of like a Panama Canal. And because of its strategic location, it became a very prominent city. But historically, 150 years before Jesus came, the city was completely destroyed by the Romans and was flattened out. And for 100 years, no one lived there. But then when Julius Caesar came to power, he put a Roman colony looking at its strategic location so that it could defend the rest of Greece, and it just exploded from then on to become one of the biggest cities of the time. There was no native population in that city because people who came in, they were not people who had several generations who grew up. It was very diverse. And so there is a kind of a DNA of a city when it is like that, because it only drew a particular kind of people who wanted to come and live there. So people who came to Corinth had just one agenda. They wanted to make it big. They wanted to make money, and they wanted to be successful, and they wanted to use the money and the fame and success they got by indulging themselves in things that would give them pleasure. To the point that there is an English word called Corinthianize, which refers to someone who is living that kind of a lifestyle of self-gratification and seeking self-pleasure. A lot of this sounds very similar to San Francisco Bay Area, isn't it? Including the fact that San Francisco has an eerie resemblance to the geography of the city of Corinth. San Francisco Bay Area was almost not a place till 150, 160 years ago, maybe a fishing village, a couple of them. The 49ers, 1849 gold rush is what brought people from all over the U.S. and even other parts of the world. And right after the gold rush was over, there came the Green Revolution of agriculture because of how fertile this land is. And after that, and fast forward, and now we really have this as the startup capital of the world, the Silicon Valley. And so when you have a place that has this kind of a DNA, it brings a particular kind of people to live there. And in fact, just like how in Corinth there weren't too many native people, if you've traveled around in the United States and looked at different cities, you'll see the difference. San Francisco Bay Area is a rootless place. People here don't have deep roots. It's always people come and leave. It's like a revolving door. And even right now, it's less than 1/3 of the people who live here were born here, perhaps even among us. Our children were probably born here, but most of us were not. And so there is a rootlessness in the place that we live in. And in that sense, there is a particular thing that drives everyone who comes here are incredibly smart people with the drive to succeed. In contrast to, I've been to Philadelphia last year and stayed there for a few weeks. You could go to some parts of Philadelphia, and there were people who are living there for 5, 6, 7 generations, rooted. And their families and extended families are there. They don't really move around a lot if that's where you grew from. Our city is not like that. And that's kind of how Corinth was. And so, and that's one of the reasons many of us are here, isn't it? Because of work-related immigration, not everybody can survive the Silicon Valley. It's brutal. You either sink or you swim. That's how life here is. So people in the East Coast do not even want to move to Silicon Valley. But that comes with its own problems. And why do I spend so much time talking about this? This is important because just like us in the city of Corinth, in this church, this was a young church, and you can read in the book of Acts how Paul goes and brings the gospel among great opposition. At first, if you look at the city, you can think I don't think there can be a church in the city. They're all such driven people, such success-oriented people, people who just want to have fun and indulge in pleasure. But God uses Paul to plant a church in that city. And these people have an experience of the gospel and come into the church. And in one sense, these are some extraordinary people with some amazing gifts, but they also have brought their carnality and worldliness into the church. So it's a church of contrasts. They were people who would be so brilliant and so accomplished. They could speak so many different languages. They would probably have started they'll be serial entrepreneurs perhaps, and all of that. But there was something missing when they came to worship God. And it's often very hard when a church is like that or a city is like that to see what is it that is really missing. So initially I thought, this passage on love will be a great passage to start the new year. It's going to be such an encouraging passage. In a sense, it really is. But Paul has some of the most harshest words for this church in this chapter. And it may be hard for some of you as we walk through that to see, is really Paul talking like this? And maybe it may even be harsh as we try to apply to ourselves. But when we understand the whole message and the truth, I don't think there can be any better way to start this new year than taking the implications of this passage. So there are 3 points I've broken this passage into. The first point is, our theme is Heart of Worship in the series on sacred worship. So what is heartless worship? We're going to look at that first. And then we are going to look at what is heartfelt worship. And then finally, the heart of worship. So Paul begins by describing what worship is not. When God says he cares about our heart, when we come into worship, Paul is hitting at the Corinthians and throwing at them some big questions to ask them, what's in your heart when you come to worship God? Because he has been talking about all the problems this church has been having. And they have been having jealousy issues, pride issues, gossip issues, immorality issues. And they've even brought that into worship. So he's saying, if you're doing all these things, let's get to the bottom of it. What is in your heart when you come to worship? Because when you come in God's presence to worship, God looks at your heart. And so he says in the first 3 verses, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. In these 3 short verses, there's a parallelism going on here. And perhaps we could preach 10 different sermons on this, and I definitely do want to come back to this and do a lot. It's just I had so much I had to figure out what am I going to say and what am I not going to say. But here's one thing I want to narrow on that stood out to me this time as I read it. He acknowledges the fact that people in this church were very gifted people. Says they were speaking different languages, and add to what, they had the gift of the Holy Spirit with which also they could speak languages they did not even know. And he talks about that in the first line. He says, I speak in the tongues of men and of angels. He's not telling them that they were actually speaking one person was speaking many languages and that there is some angelic language they are speaking. That is not what this line is talking about. He's using a hyperbole to say that because nobody can speak all languages or many languages. He was just saying there are people who are giving an emphasis on their smartness and both in a worldly way and spiritually when they do have the gift of tongues. We are going to speak about that, which helps them to speak different languages. He says you can have all that, but if your heart does not have love, and we're going to see what is that love he's talking about a little later. He says, you're a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. So he talks about 3 aspects of their giftedness. First is speaking in the tongues of men or angels. Second is if you have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and knowledge and have faith, by which he's saying you can be incredibly smart guys, brilliant guys. You may be able to comprehend the most challenging engineering problems in the world and come up with products that can be disruptive in technology outside the church. And you can also have tremendous knowledge to read and know the Bible when you have the gift of the Holy Spirit. And if you have the gift of preaching or teaching, You can be an excellent teacher, excellent preacher, and you can be a visionary. He says you have a gift of faith. You see things when others do not see, and you can start great things outside the church and inside the church, like so as to remove mountains. You can be such exorbitant visionaries. And he says, but if you have not love. And third, he says, if you are someone who is willing to give away all your money and care about social justice and even are ready to sacrifice your body to be burned for a righteous cause, it can be all of that. So he covers all the bases, but that's not what we're going to focus on. He has the parallelism that comes in an ascending crescendo. He first says, if you do this, but if you don't have love, you're a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. These were bells that were used in the temple of Demetrius in Corinth. These are these huge bells that make big noise. You stand next to it. If someone rings it, you can't even stand that. It's very irritating and annoying. And God says, that's how it feels for me, your worship. When you don't have love and you worship, it's just that irritating sound and noise. All this noise you are making in the name of speaking different languages and preaching great sermons, it's just noise. To me, it's not worship. And second, he says, for having those who are these smart preachers, teachers, visionaries, having knowledge and are brilliant and even have faith to do great things for God, maybe even willing to go as great missionaries. But if you have not love, this is what startled me. It says, I am nothing. What does that mean? What is he even talking about? And the third thing, for the third group, he says, uses the same word, I gain nothing. So he throws a bombshell to the Corinthians. You know what he's saying? It means you can do all these things and still not be a Christian. You're not saved. You don't have a real relationship with me. Now that's scary. Is that possible? Yeah, absolutely. You have evidences of this in the Old Testament. There's the prophet Balaam, the false prophets. They could do miracles. They could do fancy things. Saul, the king, he could even speak in different tongues and other things. And if you fast forward and come to the New Testament, there was Judas, a disciple of Jesus. He went with other disciples, did miracles, healed people, drove out demons. Jesus himself says in Matthew, he says about the false prophets and false teachers, he says, in the last days many will come and tell me, did we not prophesy in your name? Did we not drive out demons in your name? And what does Jesus say? I never knew you. So he's looking at these people in the church and saying, you may have great theological knowledge, you can preach great sermons, you can interpret different things in the Bible brilliantly, it's still possible that you're not saved. And it's not just in the Bible, I know this from personal experience in my own life. When God started working in my heart and I realized that something's really wrong within me, and I didn't want to follow my old path, before I could fully comprehend the grace of God and the gospel, I started preaching and teaching, and I should not have. Because my natural ability is speaking and preaching. I've done elocution and debates since I was a third grader. I was a sought-after national campus conference speaker because I can read something and just talk brilliantly. And it took a few years for me to realize I'm really not saved, because what I was doing was nobody would see me based on my giftedness and know that I'm really not saved, I'm not a Christian, because I'm saying all the right stuff. But in my heart, I was still trying to earn the grace of God in my life. Even as a pastor, many times when I speak to people, sometimes I challenge them and I say, are you saved? It offends some people. And it's not a rhetoric question. And I'm not saying that to put someone down or to be condescending. I'm really asking you that question because I've been there, not just me. There have been many great servants of God, from John Wesley to Martin Luther, who've been there. So it's possible to stay in a church and be gifted, especially if you're gifted, and still not be saved is 100% reality. And as your friend and as a pastor, when I ask you that question, it comes with love. When you go to a doctor, and if you have a medical condition like a cancer, and if the doctor wants to be nice to you and just say, oh, you just have headache, take Tylenol, that's not real love, isn't it? And so Paul is calling the entire church, he's calling out their bluff. Oh yeah, I know you can preach, I know you can teach, I know you can speak in different languages, but you're not worshiping me because you don't have me. How can you worship God when you don't have God in your heart? And so it's really challenging for a church like ours, where you may be filled with the spiritual gifts and your natural gifts and walk for several years without having a saving experience of Jesus Christ, and you're still at that point when you're not accepting the gospel of Christ and what he did on the cross and living your life by your own efforts and legalism. You're still inviting the wrath of God rather than the grace of God, and you're not saved. And it's a kind thing to be told, you are not. And Paul's doing that, and it's written in the Bible to an entire church because he loves them and he wants them to get the real gospel. So a heartless worship, in one phrase, is a worship without God in our heart. It's not the God you have made up in your imagination. It's not a God who may fit the perfect theological paradigm that you can get by reading a bunch of books. And yet, not the real God. Gifts are not a guarantee of our salvation. And that's why even many great preachers and teachers are able to do their ministry when they live a very sinful, immoral life. So he says, don't be fooled by your giftedness. Many of you are nothing, and it takes some humility to accept that. Whenever I've challenged people, people have gotten upset at me and mad at me, but some people have taken that to heart and really think and really have their lives set right. And it's a blessing when you're able to comprehend the gospel and come back to God. No. Heartless worship is worship without God. So my question to you this morning, dear friends, do you have God in your heart? If someone asks you, prove to me that you are a real Christian, what do you have to show them? Your brilliance in how you can teach or preach, or how you can speak different languages, or if you have the gift of tongues or prophecy, or how you're sacrificing and helping poor people, giving away all your money, you're ready to even burn your body. Is that all you have to show? God says it's nothing. He says you're not saved. You don't have me. You have you. You are full of you. And when you're full of you and you bring you into worship, I don't accept that worship. It's irritating to me, like this, the noisy gong and clanging cymbal. Are you so full of yourself, or do you have this grace-based relationship with God? So then begs the question, what then is heartfelt worship or heartful worship? He goes on to unpack this list, and when you first read it, it looks like, oh, this is a list. If someone wants to know what is real love or how to be loving, you just do these things, and that's what it is. And sometimes it has been preached that way too. And I've done that way back when I first read this and really didn't quite understand its context. But that is not what Paul is talking. Paul is not giving you a list of things to do so you can say, oh, you have love and you're a good Christian. And it's actually the exact opposite of that, because every single word he uses in these next few verses are words he has used previously in the rest of the book in 1 Corinthians. He says, love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. They've been doing all these things. They have not been patient with weaker Christians. They have not been kind to someone who has a different view than themselves. They were always comparing what they had and what others had, and they were jealous. They were all the time boasting about themselves. They were rude, they were arrogant. So all these things were actually problems in the church. And he's talking as a counter to that. He says what real love is love is patient, kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. And then he says, verse 7, that's like the crescendo, the highest of all. It says, love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Now let's unpack this before we try to see what is he saying overall. You know, love, he describes, if you want to understand what real love is not a feeling. We all know that. We've heard that multiple times. A love is not so much on what you feel. Love is action. There are 15 action verbs in these few verses where Paul unpacks to tell people what love is. You know, love is active. It's not abstract or passive. You know, love does not simply feel patient. It practices patience. It does not simply have kind feelings towards others. It does kind acts to one another. It does not simply recognize the truth. It rejoices in the truth. You know, 1 John 3:18, if you read, you can say that love is fully love only when it acts. So this short passage, you know, has 3 parts. It begins with 2 positive expressions of love, that love is patient and love is kind. And they are followed by 8 verbs expressing what love is not like or does not do. And the last of which is balanced by a positive counterpart. And then finally, there is the staccato of 4 verbs, each with the phrase all things. In the Greek, it's panta, you know, from which comes the word pan. You know, we use the word a lot in art and other things. He says it's love is all these, plus it has to show up in all of these categories. And let me unpack what each of them is. We've done this before, but I want to refresh our memories and then come back to a point that I want to make. So it says, first is love is patient. You know, the word is macrothumos. Macro is large, and thumos is having a compassionate heart. What does patience mean? It's viewed in terms of their relationship with one another and with God. It says patience is the ability to be taken advantage of by a person over and over again and yet not be upset or angry. What's our threshold? Chrysostom, the early church father, said it is a word which is used of the man who is wronged and who has it easily in his power to avenge himself, but will never do it. Patience never retaliates. What do? If someone wrongs you, I don't know about you, my natural instinct is I want justice. Like, how can they wrong this? How can I say this to me? How can I say this to my kids? How can they say this about my work, right? And we live in a culture that's so impatient. And I've used this illustration many times, but can't find a better one till I find I have to keep using this. Best gauge of this is a traffic light. When it goes green, How long do you take before you honk your horn if the guy doesn't move? That's the gauge for your patience indicator. If you wait more than a second, then you have somebody else honking at you from behind. That's Bay Area for you, isn't it? And it may be okay on the road, but then it's just not on the road. It comes to your home too. What's your patience threshold at home? When your kids annoy you, right? Or your brothers or sisters take away your toys or what you like and are not willing to share. Second, it says, maybe some of you are thinking, I used to have that problem, or I worked on it, and I've gotten better at it. I'm now a lot more patient person. All right, we'll see what's the problem with that in a while. Next, he says, love is kind. Just as patience will take anything from others and let them take advantage of you, kindness will give anything to others, even if it's to its enemies. Being kind is the opposite or the counterpart of being patient. It not only desires the welfare of the other person, it actually works for it. If someone hurts you, you're not just tolerating that, you want to do something good back to them. Absolutely un-Bay Area-like, isn't it? You never do that at work. You only see the other opposite. Let's move on quickly. Love is not jealous. Jealousy or envy has two forms. One form says, I want what someone else has. If they have a better car than we do, or a better job than we do, or a better home than we do, or a better grade than we do, or a better toy than you do, you want that. And if they are praised for something they do, we want the same or more for ourselves. It can happen at work, even in ministry. That sort of jealousy is bad enough. The worst kind, it says, I wish they didn't have what I have. The second sort of jealousy is more than selfish. It's desiring evil for someone. It is jealousy on the most deepest, most corrupt and disruptive level. And it happens, sadly, in the church in Corinth. They were jealous about spiritual gifts. If someone could teach better or preach better or prophesy better or speak tongues better, they were jealous all the time. Maybe some of you are thinking, I used to have a problem with jealousy, but I've worked on it. I've gotten better now. Not that jealous like before. I'll tell you what the problem with that is in a while. Then it talks about love does not brag. Bragging is the other side of jealousy. Jealousy is wanting what someone else has. Bragging is more subtle. Bragging is trying to make others jealous of what we have. I see this all the time, especially with our kids. When one of them gets a gift, flashy new toy, before they can enjoy, they want to show the other person, I won't name who that is, see what I got? See what this does? No. It's funny when kids do that, isn't it? But as adults, we do the same, except we know to mask it. We are very sophisticated. We are very good at that. And you get some joy when you do that. I'm like, yeah, How are you doing, brother? I'm all right. How's your job? I mean, it's been tough, but my company went IPO and they've given some stops. I mean, work hard, long hours, but I know your job, is probably not very challenging, and you get to go home early and see? Where am I in? Bragging. C.S. Lewis calls bragging the utmost evil. He says it is the epitome of pride, which is the root sin of all sins. Bragging puts ourselves first. Everyone else, including God, must therefore be of less importance to us. It is impossible to build ourselves up without putting others down. When we brag, we can be up only if others are down. Have you been in that situation at work or even at ministry or elsewhere? When you see someone is a rising star and they have some talent and they are growing up, and you can't really compete with them because they're actually better than you and smarter than you, what you can do is belittle them in a very nice, polite, diplomatic way. And you may come across as a soft-spoken, nice person, but in your heart, you know exactly what you're doing is you're just putting this other person down, and you feel good about that, isn't it? Contrast that to Paul. He says, I count all things a loss for the surpassing greatness of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord. Perhaps some of you are thinking, I used to be like that. Bragging was a problem. I've changed. I've become better. I don't brag much. God has helped me change in that area. I'll tell you what a problem with that is in a while. Next, he says, love is not arrogant or proud. These are all problems this church had. It says they were puffed up, conceited about their knowledge of doctrine, their spiritual gifts, and the famous teachers they had. They could say, hey, I believe in this version of Reformed theology, that version of that theology. They were so jaded in their pride. They even boasted about their worldliness, idolatry, immorality, including incest, which was practiced by pagans. They were arrogant rather than repentant. They bragged rather than mourning. Paul says, love, by contrast, is not arrogant. William Carey, who is often referred to as the father of modern missions, he was a brilliant linguist in India. He was responsible for translating parts of the Bible into no fewer than 34 different languages and dialects. And he had been raised in a simple home in England, and in his early manhood worked as a cobbler for his job. So in India, he was often ridiculed for his low birth and farmer occupation. And at a dinner party one evening, a person went up to him and said, I understand, Mr. Carey, that you once worked as a shoemaker. Oh, no, your lordship, Carey replied. I was not a shoemaker, only a shoe repairman. How that person would have felt. And Proverbs reminds us, when pride comes, then comes dishonor. Pride and arrogance breed contention with which the Corinthian church was filled. And perhaps some of you are thinking, well, I used to be a proud person. Not anymore. I'm now a humble person. I've grown in that. And in a way, it looks like these are all like relatively easy to do. Yeah, I can become patient. I can be kind. I have actually grown. I'm not that bad like how I used to be. And you look at this as a list of to-do things to evaluate your spirituality and may feel that you've actually arrived, and then he throws a second bomb. Okay, let me tell you what else love is. It's not just being kind, patient, and not boastful or arrogant. Now he uses the panta bombs. He says, love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. You know what this means? He says when you really have grown in love, when you love someone, you're willing to love them unconditionally at all cost. You're willing to bear all their shortcomings and still love them, not just once or twice, but always. You're willing to believe in this person irrespective of their brokenness, their weakness and their sinfulness, and still love them as though they were perfect at all times, all. And you're willing to not just love this person, you're willing to hope that they are still going to be a beautiful person one day, and you're going to continue to love them. And lastly, even if this person is not nice to you, it says endures all things. We don't have time to go into the Greek words of these. It's fascinating. Even if they are hurting you, you're going to love them, not only when they are nice to you and they do good things to you, especially when they are hurting you at all times. Match that. Beat that. Can you? Is there anyone here in this church, he asks the Corinthians, able to love like this? So when you go through this list, you're not supposed to think and put a tick mark. Yeah, I am a much more patient person now. I'm a much more kind person now. I'm not as rude as before. I'm not selfish. I don't brag. But when you come here, it's like the top of the mountain, and you're like, no, I can't love somebody like that. I can't even love my wife like that. I can't even love my kids like that. When they mess up with me, when they don't measure up to me, when they don't do things that make me happy, I can't. I am not able to. That's the response Paul wants them to have. But on the contrary, if you were looking at this as a checklist and saying, well, I'm a better person, I'm a good person, I'm a patient person, I'm a growing Christian, he says, you are nothing, zero, zilch. You're irritating to God, your worship is, because you're just filled with self. You're only thinking about yourself all the time. You're looking at everyone and comparing yourself. Oh, how's their marriage? How are their kids? How's their job? How's their life? How's their spirituality? Oh, how's their preaching? How's their teaching? How is their sharing? How is their giving? Your mind is always looking around and comparing and then feeling better about yourself. And you're not able to love if someone says one small word to hurt you, if someone doesn't measure up to your standard of what you expect them to be, you can't love. Then he says you are nothing. You know why? You can't do this if you don't have God in your life. And if you're trying to do this, you're not a Christian. Deal with it, Corinthians. That's not love. You know what is love? Love is not a bunch of to-do activities. In fact, there was only one person who was able to do this, and that was Jesus Christ. If there was one person who was able to consistently, excellently, and exceedingly do all of these characteristics, not just once, but in your relationship with him at all times, that is Jesus Christ. He is patient. He is kind. He's not boastful, he's sacrificial, he gives everything. You know, when he says, when you have not love, what he's saying is, God alone is love. So it's a synonym for God. Says you have not love means, he says you don't have God. Your version of God, your vision of God is a defective God. You think you can do all these things and please God and become a better person. That's what I thought. You know, I had a pretty radical change in my life. I was not very proud of the things I did before, but now after becoming a Christian, I thought, oh, now I have to be good. Now I have to be perfect. And only then God will like me. Only then God will love me. And I started getting into a doing mode of trying to fix myself and not realizing that's no better than how I was before, except now I've become a legalistic person. I've started obeying the law, trying to keep the law and to earn God's love through that, not realizing I can't because the bar is so high. All people at all times, like our formula that you probably bored to death now, right? 100% of me should love God and love others 100% of the time. You can't. That should be your response when you hear this, rather than saying, I have and I am. And in your relationship with God, you can do that too. They were not patient. When God doesn't give them what they wanted, they would grumble. I want God give me what I want now. They weren't willing to use their gifts to patiently serve others. So that's the second bombshell Paul is telling them. You know what is a heartful worship? Is a worship that has God in the heart and not self. And if you have all these things, you don't have God. And that should make you to come to God. And by the way, when you see this is what God has done to you, you start loving this God in a very dramatic way. Oh, this God, my God has been so patient with me. Every time I've messed up, He didn't let me go to hell. He's been so kind. He gives me mercies every morning. He bears all my shortcomings. He endures my insufficiency. He hopes in me, restoring. He hopes that I will one day be with Him. This should help us to see real love, and that is in God, and fall in love with that God, and then have that love for God in our heart when we come to worship. Because when you then experience that kind of a love, many of us probably never experienced that kind of a love when we were growing up, even if you had the best of parents, because that kind of a love can only be experienced through a relationship with Jesus Christ. But when you experience that kind of a love, by the way, these things are a list. You will start easily be able to do these things. You will now really be able to be patient with someone, knowing that God is patient with you every day. You will really be able to be kind to someone. And you will want to do that. You will not be jealous because now you are set. You're not pursuing that elusive thing that you think only if I have that, I will have a restful identity. You have Christ, so you're not worried if someone is better than you or worse than you, because you know you need Jesus, and that is all that matters. And you'll be able to not brag or be jealous or not want to put somebody down to make yourself feel better, because you've tasted real love, you see. And then you bring that into the church and you can look at everyone with the eyes of love. Now you are not trying to earn God's love by cleaning up your life. And if you're still doing that, I'm sorry to say you're still not a Christian, no matter how many years you've been one. But you have tasted this real love. You won't even try because you know you can't. This is just so high a bar, and only Jesus has done. And lastly, he goes on in the next 5 verses to talk about what is the heart of worship, which we have already kind of highlighted. It says verse 8 to 13, love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. So now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. You know, Paul is now talking about really the heart of worship. He says your gifts, your talents, and your spiritual gifts, at one point, they are going to end. They may not even be needed. They will cease, they will pass away. And then he uses 2 illustrations to highlight an important part, to drive home what the heart of worship is. The first illustration is about being a child and growing to be a man. And the second illustration is about seeing through a mirror and seeing in person. So he says, firstly, he's looking at these Corinthians and he's saying, don't be a child. Many of them were childlike. You know, they want stuff to keep them entertained, and that's what people sometimes do. I remember when Brian and Sophia were really young, we wanted to take them out for a movie, and we thought they might actually like that movie. I don't remember exactly, maybe Lion King, or I'm not sure what that movie was, and we took them to a theater and had them sit in this nice, cozy recliners. And the movie started, and they were excited and fascinated by this big screen and the loud noises. And as long as there was action and explosive stuff happening and things like that, they were attentive. But the moment the characters started speaking dialogues, they would just start getting down and walking around and bothering people behind them and forward of them. And then we decided, let's wait for 2 more years before bringing them to the theater. So he says, you're childlike. You want entertainment when you come to worship. You want to be entertained. You want God to make you feel cozy and nice and happy and give you whatever you ask. That's why you come. God, take away my problem. Make my life happy and exciting. He says, that's childlike. Grow up. Grow up. That's not what worship is all about. It says, when I became a man, I gave up childish ways. When you understand love, that it's not about the gifts, but it's about the giver. You don't want to focus on the gifts and miss the giver. You want to fall in love with the giver. That's when real worship happens. That's the heart of worship. And the second illustration he gives, of course, he's talking about the eschatological consummation when Christ comes again. He says, for now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. You know, if I ask you this morning, do you all think we are together here in this church this morning? Are you with me? Let me ask you, are you with me? Some of you in the front are yes, in the back are lost in your thoughts maybe. Yeah, you are with me, I am with you. But this is different than if I step down and come and then I meet you face to face. You know, I probably have shared this story. I might end up in trouble after getting home. I'll nevertheless attempt at it. Remember the first time I met my wife, Jemima? There were 10 other people in that room. We were together. We were in the same room. And it was the first time we were supposed to meet one another. And they thought after 30, 40 minutes, we have met each other. And my sister asked, shall we leave? And I said, well, we can leave, but this is it. I haven't met her. And I'm going to leave if I don't meet her, one-on-one. And I don't want to go into the rest of the drama. They did set up something like that. But then I remember the next day, or that week, I might get into trouble about that because I forgot the date. I took her out on a date. It was on a restaurant right next to where she worked. And it was just me and her for the first time sitting across the table or maybe next to each other. Again, another problem. And seeing her face to face, eye to eye. And I tell you, that was special. It's still special. You know, first time I held her hand, I looked in her eyes. I remember it in vivid detail. And we talk about this so many times. And we try to recreate that experience, even here when we go sometimes to some restaurants. Because when I see her face to face, what's happening is, we are in each other's presence. We are so close. We are just enjoying knowing each other so closely and so intimately. And there is no more barriers that prevent us from getting that deep, intimate knowledge. And that's what Paul is talking. There will be a time when you see God face to face. Now we see him dimly, we understand him dimly. And when you see him in like that, that's the height of worship. And that's a worship that's going to take all of eternity to unpack and unravel for us. Even the entire eternity is not enough to know God so deeply and enjoy his presence. And that's the heart of worship. The heart of worship is having God in our heart and being in God's presence and basking in the glorious excellence of who God is. That's the heart of worship. You're not going to need prophecies then to tell this is how God is going to be like. You're not going to need the gift of tongues. There are going to be no unbelievers in heaven. not going to need more knowledge because you will see Christ in all his fullness. And so for worship, we do need these. We need faith to believe in what we still don't see. We need hope to trust in our future resurrection hope, which he will talk about soon in the next few chapters. But we need love, which is our reason to worship now and ever. We worship what we love. And that's the question Paul is asking the Corinthians today. When God looks at us, when we come for worship, he's looking straight into our heart and seeing what's in there. What do you got in there? Do you have me, or is it filled with yourself? Is there love for me and genuine love for one another? Yeah. If you're someone who thinks, oh, I have truth, I know all the aspects of truth, but then you're not able to apply it correctly in your life to love God the way he ought to be and love others. Truth without love isn't real truth, and love without truth isn't real love. Let me repeat. Truth without love isn't real truth, and love without truth isn't real love. And God wants us to come to worship him, and worship him in spirit and in truth. So I want to leave us with these questions this morning. Ask yourselves, as you look at this list, how you are leading your spiritual life. What's in your heart? Are you really saved? I want to ask that to each and every single one of us. It's my job. As a loving shepherd, I need to. And there is a high possibility some of you are not. Either because there are three groups of people. One group who do not care about who God is and what he wants, and want to do what gives them joy and pleasure in life. They are the non-religious people, and I was like that for a major part of my life. There is another group of people who know that they are not perfect, they are fallen, they are sinful, but still come and try to earn God's grace through legalism and good works and trying to tick the marks in this list. You're still not saved. You're a religious person, but you're not saved. There is the third group of people who have come to recognize that they can never match the high demands of what it takes to love God with our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbors as ourselves, and run to Jesus and see that he has loved you like you can never experience love before, and then have a desire to reflect that love by demonstrating these. And that's Paul's desire for this church in Corinth. And that should be our desire this year as we start this year, that God may grant us to have that experience. So every time we come to worship, we know what's in our heart, and that it will not be a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal, but a pleasing aroma before God. Let's pray.